it was just the way things happened, you know. It started off, I didn't write, they wrote, then I started to write.
Every day, I share another story from the Golden Age and the moments that shaped an unforgettable era. If you'd like to keep these memories alive with me, hit subscribe. It costs you nothing, but it means a lot. Thank you for being here. Now let's begin. Most people remember George Harrison as the quiet Beatle. Calm, spiritual, the last guy anyone would expect to hold a grudge. He stood beside Lennon, McCartney, and Starr as they cranked out legends like Yesterday, Let It Be, and Hey Jude, songs that felt untouchable. But behind all that glory, one of those very bandmates dragged George into the darkest moment of his life, embarrassing him, betraying him, and leaving wounds he carried all the way to his final breath. Wounds he later exposed at 58, flipping everything we thought we knew about him. But before we expose the bandmate who pushed George over the edge, we have to rewind to the early days. Because the roots of this betrayal go way deeper than anyone expected. Long before the world knew George as the quiet Beatle, he was just a tiny kid in a cramped little 2-up, 2-down house at 12 Arnold Grove, trying to stay warm in a place so cold you could literally see your breath indoors during winter. The toilet sat outside in the yard, the walls leaked cold air, and comfort was a luxury they simply didn't have. Inside that little house lived a mother who instantly sensed something different about her youngest child. Louise Harrison, known for singing loud enough that neighbors joked her voice rattled the windows, had a strange habit while pregnant. Every Sunday, she tuned into Radio India, letting sitars and tablas echo through the room. She believed those sounds calmed the restless baby inside her, and years later, George admitted those hypnotic tones never left his bones. It already felt like fate whispering to him. George loved sketching guitars in his school books, but school itself felt like a sentence. No guitars, no music, no space for a kid wired like him. Everything changed one random afternoon in 1956 when he was biking past a house and heard Elvis Presley's Heartbreak Hotel blasting through a window. He froze on the spot, stunned. He later said the moment hit him like an explosion in a neighborhood where nothing ever happened. Elvis sounded like a doorway cracking open, and George couldn't look away. At 14, he begged his mother for a guitar. She scraped together 3 pounds and 10, a huge amount for their family, and he practiced until his fingers stung and bled. Lonnie Donegan's skiffle sound fueled him enough to form his first group, the Rebels. It was messy, it was loud, but it was theirs, and it lit something inside him. Then destiny slid in once again. On the bus to school, George met a kid named Paul McCartney. Same route, same love for guitars. Paul later called George his baby brother, but back then, they were just 2 schoolboys leaning over bus seats, showing each other chords and dreaming about stages they'd never even seen in person. In March 1958, Paul brought George to audition for John Lennon's group, The Quarrymen. John thought he looked way too young, snapping, "He looks 12!" But George wasn't leaving without proving himself. He pulled out his guitar on the top deck of a dark bus, playing the lead to Raunchy, while the only light came from a lone street lamp outside. When he finished, Lennon didn't say a word, but his silence was louder than applause. George was in. Just like that, 3 kids from Liverpool with cheap guitars and oversized dreams found themselves tied together by music they couldn't even imagine would change the world. But none of them knew that ego, jealousy, pride, and deep personal wounds would later twist that brotherhood into a battlefield, one that left real scars. By the time the Beatles hit their absolute peak, George Harrison's place inside the band was already starting to quietly crumble, especially with John Lennon. From the outside, the world saw 4 brothers, unstoppable, inseparable, untouchable. But inside Studio 2 at Abbey Road, George felt more and more like the guy standing in the corner, the extra body in the room, the voice nobody bothered to hear. And the part that stung the most? It was coming from the one person George had once looked up to the most, John Lennon. And John, the man George once idolized, slowly turned into the one who cut him down the hardest. The tension crept in quietly during the mid-1960s, right when George finally started writing songs he felt proud of. He walked into the studio with If I Needed Someone, carrying rare confidence, only for John to glance at it once and shrug, "It's nothing." It wasn't critique. It was a straight-up brush-off. George went home that night without saying a word, telling Patty Boyd only, "John didn't even hear the song." From that moment on, every time George grew, John seemed to drift away, like Harrison's evolution was something Lennon just couldn't handle. When George threw himself into meditation and Indian philosophy, hoping to find peace, John mocked him right in front of everyone. "You and your gurus, it's just another trap." George didn't clap back, but Ringo later said the look on his face was like someone had stabbed him in front of the whole room. The quiet one wasn't blind, he felt every dig. The real breaking point hit during the Let It Be sessions. In the raw Get Back footage from 2021, George tries to explain a simple guitar idea, but John doesn't even look at him. Eyes fixed on nothing, like George wasn't even in the room. After several suffocating seconds of being ignored, George finally snapped and let it spill out. "I'll play whatever you want, or I won't play at all." That line wasn't frustration, or it was years of being overshadowed erupting in one breath. And when the Beatles finally split, that buried anger didn't fade, it exploded. In 1973, during John's chaotic Lost Weekend, he and George met in a New York hotel. Everyone expected a friendly catch-up, maybe even some laughs. Instead, the room froze when John casually suggested they should play Madison Square Garden together. George's face flared instantly. He jumped up and shouted, "Where were you when I needed you?" Then he reached over, yanked John's glasses right off his face, and slammed them onto the floor. May Pang later wrote that John froze completely. She said it was one of the only moments where John Lennon was genuinely scared of George Harrison. The quiet man finally unloaded 10 years of silence, disrespect, and feeling abandoned by someone he once loved deeply. Paul McCartney, the one, George Harrison, quietly resented until the end. People always focus on George's issues with John, but the truth that still shocks hardcore Beatles fans is this. The longest, deepest conflict George carried wasn't with Lennon, it was with Paul McCartney. And unlike the blow-up with John in '73, the tension with Paul was colder, quieter, and far more painful. It started slowly in the late '60s, when Paul began tightening his grip on the band's sound. George would walk into the studio with songs he'd spent months polishing, and Paul would start rearranging them on the spot. Engineer Jeff Emmerich remembered moments where Paul literally stood over George's shoulder, telling him exactly how to play a part Paul had written, micromanaging him to the ground. Emmerich later said it felt suffocating, like Paul didn't trust George at all. George eventually cracked open the truth in a 1974 interview, a quote he only ever said once. "Paul ruined me as a guitarist." Then he clarified he didn't mean technically, he meant emotionally. Paul's nonstop criticism, nonstop direction, nonstop dismissals crushed George's confidence from the inside. One of the worst moments came during the never-ending recording of Maxwell's Silver Hammer. George hated the song. Everyone hated it. But Paul insisted they redo it over and over. After days of takes, George muttered to Ringo, "Why are we doing this?" Paul overheard and snapped back, "Because it's my song." That icy tone stayed burned in George's memory forever. But the real break came in January 1969 on day 2 of Let It Be. George finally told Paul straight up that he didn't like being told exactly how to play every single guitar part. And in that moment, decades of quiet resentment began turning into something George would carry long after the Beatles were gone. Paul said, "I'm trying to help you, George." But George fired back a line that Beatles historians still call the realest moment in the whole film. "You don't listen to anyone else." That sentence hit like a truth bomb. George finally admitting he felt invisible standing next to Lennon-McCartney. And even decades later, that sting never fully faded. In 1987, someone asked George if he'd ever join a band with Paul again. He didn't even blink before answering, "I'd join a band with John, but not with Paul. It's nothing personal, just musical." Everyone knew it was personal. Even near the end of his life, George carried a quiet wound Paul never quite understood. A wound carved by a friendship that never found the right balance. George Harrison's final chapter started long before the world knew anything was wrong. By the late 1990s, he had already fought through throat cancer, then lung cancer, and eventually a brain tumor that left him exhausted but still determined to create. Even during radiation treatments, he pushed himself to work on the songs that became brainwashed. Donnie later said he once walked into the room and saw his father whispering melodies into a recorder because his voice was too weak to rise above a whisper. The urgency in those small recordings said everything. George knew he was racing time. In the last weeks of his life, the pain hit harder, and the doctors' faces told the truth without saying a word. George understood. He asked to be moved to Los Angeles into a private home owned by Gavin DeBecker, a place where he could spend his final days with Olivia and Donnie close by. The room was filled with soft light, flowers, and devotional chanting, sounds he had followed since 1966, not as decoration, but as comfort during the sharpest waves of pain. As November 2001 drew to a close, speaking became difficult. Visitors arrived quietly, one by one. Messages came from Ravi Shankar. Tom Petty cried while talking to him on the phone. Even Paul McCartney came to say goodbye. A moment that was emotional, awkward, and unexpectedly gentle all at once. On November 29, 2001, surrounded by Olivia and Donnie, George slipped into a calmer state. His breathing slowed, his eyes softened, and in those last moments, his family recited prayers from the Bhagavad Gita, the same words he had lived by for decades. A final whisper left his lips, meant only for the people closest to him, and then his body finally let go. What happened next surprised even people inside the industry. His ashes were flown to India and released into the Ganges and Yamuna during a private ceremony arranged with deep respect. It was exactly the farewell George always wanted. Spiritual, simple, and rooted in the beliefs that shaped everything he created. And his legacy just keeps getting stronger. Here comes the sun. While my guitar gently weeps, all things must pass, the concert for Bangladesh, his 2 Rock and Roll Hall of Fame inductions, all of it turned the so-called quiet Beatle into one of the most influential artists of the entire century. Even today, musicians describe him the same way Donnie does, someone who followed his own path even when it cost him. George Harrison carried his pain quietly and far longer than anyone knew, and now you know the story he never said out loud. But here's the question. If you were in his place, could you forgive the person who hurt you the most? Drop your thoughts in the comments below, hit that like button if you felt something real, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories.